by chatting a little bit about what is the role of critics and reviewers as it pertains to, video games and film. And I guess as part of this transition, right, we'll just bring in what we normally talk about, which is the game side of things, because obviously we've been talking exclusively about film. But there's a lot of criticisms levied at games, critics, and reviewers for being, any myriad of things, like not good enough at the game to be able to play it, or not in the target audience for the game. And, therefore maybe they shouldn't be reviewing it, and all of these different kinds of things. And I guess what I'll just say as we're going in, Aaron, even before we even say like, what is the role? I think a lot of these criticisms get levied because there's a fundamental disconnect between like the target audience of the product and the reviewer themselves, right? Like that's where I see a lot of these disconnects. Like if you've got all these Academy reviewers talking about Super Mario Galaxy, they don't think about it from like a parent's perspective when they're reviewing it, because to your point earlier, they're trying to put it in this like very specific lens that they have. And I feel like it's that disconnect that ultimately leads to a lot of these discussions and disputes and whatnot.
Right. Yeah, no, I would agree. I think okay, so the big issue here is the tendency of platforms as the venue that we have for some reason collectively decided to have our conversations on, by which I mean, Twitter, right? The platform, Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, what have you, right? The platforms that have become the public forum for conversation they exist to demolish the concept of nuance. Nuance dies on Twitter. And unfortunately, a conversation about what is the role of a critic versus the role of an audience member and whose opinion on the quality of any given entertainment product, that entire argument lives inside of a big bubble labeled nuance, because there is no black and white answer. There is no one person is right and the other person is wrong. You're right, there is a disconnect. There's always going to be a disconnect. Art is in its entirety and by design subjective. So yes, you're going to have that problem. There are going to be people who disagree with your skill level playing a game. There are going to be people who say that you're a paid shill. There are going to be people who, 1,000 different other things. The way it breaks down to me is more, and this is not even close to a perfect metaphor, and I'm kind of building the car while I drive here, so bear with me if this does not quite work. Okay, so let's say that the Super Mario Galaxy movie is whatever the sugariest cereal on the shelf is, right? Kids are going to absolutely flock to it. They're going to love it. It does not necessarily mean that it is good for them. It does not necessarily mean that it is an objectively good representation of food. But it is food that they will love to consume. The role of the critic is to say, hopefully from a nuanced perspective, children will love to eat this cereal, but it is devoid of nutritional value. Whereas the audience version of it is to say, I really liked eating this cereal. That's more or less where we find ourselves, in my opinion, in terms of like, maybe not what the role of them should be, but which roles do they fill? That's about as close as I can get.
Well, so I did you skim through, it's not a very long article, but that giant freaking robot article that I kind of randomly found?
I did not get a chance to go through that one, no.
So I actually have no idea what giant freaking robot is. So I was mostly just kind of online looking for what people thought the purpose of critics were to, inform my opinion a little bit more. So it wasn't just purely vibes. And I actually think that article does a really solid job of explaining what I think the role of critics ultimately is, and kind of further illuminating where there's an issue, which is to say that I think the role of critics is to, be critical of the work and express whether or not they like the movie, and not necessarily assess the nutritional value of it, but utilize their unique filter, their unique perspective to hopefully shed some light on, what you might or might not like. I think where the failure happens here, and this gets referenced in this little article, is people take shit way too serious. If people, if there's a critic and they say, I don't like the Super Mario Galaxy movie, a ton of people will take that really personally if they did it, and then they'll get pissed, and then they'll start being a dick about it, and it's weird. So that's one stage where there's kind of a failure. And ultimately, where I'm going with this is I do think a lot of the failure actually ends up happening on the audience part, because I think we've forgotten that, really what reviewers are about is I think you've probably find a reviewer that has similar taste to you, and then you're like, okay, well, X reviewer really likes this, so maybe I'll like it. And that's the point of having so many different critics and reviewers, right? Is that there's a myriad of taste out there that you can look at to properly or more accurately assess what you might think of a film. The problem is that Rotten Tomatoes is an aggregator of a bunch of different critic scores. And critics are going to think more critically than a normal consumer because that is their job. So the score will be lower. But there's probably some very glowing reviews of the Super Mario movie that are more focused on parents and people with kids and whatnot. So instead of getting mad at critics at large, maybe your goal should be to find a critic that resonates with you. Because by God, there's 100% going to be content like that on YouTube that you can find, or even websites that are tailored for parents and kids. So I think that's the biggest problem, is people are looking at all critics equally when it's no, you have to find the critic that matches your taste. And actually the Giant Freaking Robot article has this really good quote, and he basically says it's up to the consumer to filter their own taste through what a critic says. And I think that that's 100% true. He basically says this isn't a ruler, it's a barometer. I just thought it was a very smart article in how he went about it. Those are kind of my general thoughts on all of it.
No, I would completely agree with that. I think that and I don't think that even stands in opposition to what I'm talking about. I think that that's more or less what I mean. I don't literally mean the nutritional value of a movie. I mean, obviously not literally, but I mean the broad swath of critics are going to apply the same general set of expectations. Does the plot make sense? Is there, good character work? Is there clever writing? Is blah, blah, blah. All of these things that would constitute for me the nutritional value of a movie. Is it enjoyable? Is it just broadly speaking this? Right. But, and then like you said, every single critic will then apply whatever their critical lens is to a film in a different perspective based on their own position within life, within the socioeconomic landscape, within the hierarchy of critics, within the family structure, within, 1,000 different things. Who's their audience? Who are they trying to make their audience? So the worst thing that aggregators have done is feed into that social media illusion of a binary. Right? The idea that there is a black and a white, a set of good guys and bad guys, a series of right answers and wrong answers, a series of haves and have-nots, and there's no room in the middle between those two extremes. So there is now no room in the middle between critics as one singular entity and audiences as one singular entity, disregarding the fact that 59, 43, whatever percent, critic score is made up of potentially hundreds of individuals, and the audience score is made up of God only knows how many specific individuals. It's not literally one camp versus another camp. This is not an organized endeavor unless it is one of those, and those are usually fairly toxic when executed on Metacritic. Mm-hmm. I completely agree with you. The landscape of criticism is so wide open that you can and should find critical voices that align with your needs, with your wants, with your likes, with your expectations as an audience member, and then don't treat, critics are not court. critics are not legally enforcing anything. There's no governing body of them saying, and we, the critics, twirled our mustaches and decided to hate on the galaxy of Mario. That didn't happen. That doesn't happen. Critics are not a monolith up against which audience members need to throw themselves in order to topple an evil regime. It's a series of people with their own opinions. So yeah, no, I agree with you on that front. And then just one other kind of little note inside of that is that I'm actually no longer 100% convinced that the argument between, or like there's any real difference between straight up journalists, game journalists, and online video game commentators who basically serve the same function in 2026. There's really not that much difference between those things. So the quality of the journalism across the board may have dipped, in terms of who is considered a critic, because you don't just have trained journalists, but also that does increase that diversity of perspectives angle, where you do now not just have 4 or 5 or 6 or even 10 major print publications sort of dictating the discourse from a critical perspective. You have critics who are community members of a very active sub-community. You have critics who are still, our big print media people. We saw this a lot with like Crimson Desert, which was another game that recently came out and absolutely split the shit out of critics and audiences. And there are 1,000 different nuanced reasons for that, up to and including scheduling issues with the review codes and review embargoes and stuff like that. And also, patch schedules. But none of that gets factored in to the argument when people are angry that critics didn't review Crimson Desert very well. But again, you have some commentators on the internet who hate on it to hate on it. And then you have some legacy print people who, or not even legacy print, but like modern print people like Paul Tassi from Forbes who absolutely loved Crimson Desert, right? So yeah, there's a whole world of traditional media outlets and non-traditional media outlets for you to peruse to find an opinion that jives with your expectations.
One quick thing that I wanted to hit on, you were talking about there maybe being a disconnect between critics and viewers. I actually think, at least based on some of the data that we've seen, that disconnect may not really be there. I mean, it is there in the sense that critics are more critical, but if you look at the 2 Super Mario movies that we were talking about earlier, just because it's the data that's in front of me, Super Mario Bros. 2023, which was generally considered to be a better film, has a better critic score than Super Mario Galaxy. The same is the case for the audience score, which is to suggest that critics do appreciate movies more that audiences like more.